rocks and stripper poles, or fucking centerfolds. So I got secrets only me and all my niggas know. A kicking in the doors, I send a...
Hey, Jake, why are you in a bathtub? Hey! Fuck you. So, a few nights ago, I saw a film. Little film you may have heard of called Hereditary. It's a movie that you may have heard the band of critics that you follow freaking out about. I know the critics in my sphere sure have been, myself included, really. At least, sort of.
See, that's the thing about Hereditary. As a horror film, a drama, and just as a film, it succeeds in spades. I thought Annihilation was going to be the movie that gave me the most to chew on this year, but Hereditary is just... it's kind of difficult to handle. It's also difficult to talk about, especially considering, well, I feel bad calling it good because, quite frankly, assigning this movie with positive adjectives feels inherently kind of dishonest. Let me explain. Lots of horror movies are effective for some reasons that you don't even realize. Halloween, as the lovely and talented film critic Nick Spheres put it, is effective not just because Michael Myers is a scary man in a scary mask, but because it portrays the suburban nightmare. It damages the inherent safety that a lot of people felt when the movie came out because horror hadn't yet put them out of their comfort zone. Seeing a scary monster man in a normal neighborhood at the time was new in mainstream horror, but you don't really think about that while you're watching it. So, naturally, it took me a while to truly articulate why Hereditary hits as hard as it does, beyond the fact that it's just scary. So,
Part 1, it's just scary.
Okay, this little segment is more or less me just trying to explain why the film exceeds on a purely visual level. So, Hereditary is shot and edited so precisely and beautifully that it accomplishes something few other films do. That, of course, being so good that you don't notice these actual elements. Once a film immerses you, the job of an editor and a DP is to create a level of coherency that traps you inside your own viewing experience. Hereditary, from its opening shot, does exactly that. The movie also really cleverly plays with two very basic elements of filmmaking, lighting and focus. There's a shot that's repeated 3 times in the film that's a very fluid pull-in on Peter's face, and then pans over slowly to build anticipation at what he's looking at. These cuts between the shots of his face and the shots of what he's looking at are so perfectly timed that they always elicit a bit of shock from you, even though there's no noise or even stinger music. The first real scare of the film is actually a shot that's entirely silent, which really sets the tone for the rest of the film. Setup and payoff is another reason why this movie is so effective. Usually, you're probably used to hearing about that in a more narrative sense, but here I mean it in a more visual way. There's one shot that specifically occurs towards the start of the film that's just a close-up on a character's eyes, and it holds there just for long enough for you to be afraid of what exactly this character is so shocked about, and the payoff for this is executed so well I heard actual gasps and screams from one single shot that did nothing but show the result of something horrible. Any other horror movie would have showed you the goods way too quickly and likely in too much detail, because it wants to show off its effects and to get the audience to jump a little bit. But in Hereditary, it's something that really gets under your skin because of the smart setup it has, making these payoffs burn themselves into your fragile little minds. Another thing it has going for it is the pacing of its horror. You've probably heard a lot of comparisons to Rosemary's Baby or The Shining, and I think that's appropriate because all of these horror films slowly build to a third act that can only be called batshit crazy. And even then, Hereditary gives The Shining a run for its money. So much so that some of the shit that happens at the end is kind of goofy, purely because it ran out of uncomfortable fucked up shit to show you, so it just sort of shows you shit that's just plain weird. It's like the bear costume in The Shining. It just makes you uncomfortable and kind of confused, which makes it all way more overwhelming. That, and just to get this out of the way, the filmmaking and writing at play here is top-notch, the kind of elegant narrative balance that you'd see in movies that get released during Oscar season. It follows in the vein of films like The Exorcist because it grounds itself in human drama so well for the first 2 acts, and the movie could work outside of its horror context. It gives you characters and dilemmas that you need to latch onto, but without being manipulative. Whatever investment it gets from you, it's completely earned, so the horror just feels way more potent once it actually gets there. And even though the third act is crazy, it doesn't exactly save its bag of tricks for the end. It dulls out everything very purposefully. Oh, and the gore effects are like absolutely seamless and always feel very real. When you make a risky horror film like this, you have to walk a very tight tightrope of filmmaking. And Ari Aster, the director, doesn't so much walk across this line as he does dance across it. By the way, this is his first movie? How? No, really, how? I'm shocked this even got a wide release, especially considering the content, but damn, man. I will be following your career from here on out. And yeah, this was the first time in my life where I witnessed people leave the theater. I always heard stories about people vomiting when The Exorcist was released, or people thinking that The Shining really wasn't all that scary and saying it was bad when it came out, and for the first time ever, I've experienced something like that. Like I said in my car review, I had a full-on panic attack in this movie, and it really just put me on edge. I was shaking in my seat, heavily breathing, heart pounding out of my chest, and I was tempted to leave to escape the atmosphere that felt like it was crushing my body. But I was frozen. Out of fear. And the movie is so compelling it just had me locked in. I won't lie, that's never happened to me before, and I like to consider myself a horror veteran. Movies like The Shining make me feel comfortable and warm in really weird and obtuse ways. Looking back on it, Hereditary earned my respect just because of how potent it felt.
Part 2. This movie is engineered to make you feel horrible.
So, okay, I just want to take a brief moment to reiterate something I said in my car review. If you have anxiety or you suffer from some form of mental illness, I am warning you. This movie will take its toll on you. It certainly did me, and it certainly did with a lot of other people I know. The way the horror in this film works, combined with the taxing narrative, makes us easy prey for being affected by it. My panic attack comment was not a joke or hyperbole. There was a moment when I thought to myself, wow, I might need to leave. And because the story involves a lot of elements involving anxiety, mental health, coupled with how the movie flip-flops constantly in your view of the main character in regards to their overall sanity changes, it proves to be really effective. It keeps you guessing until the moment it reveals its hand. Going back and forth between, is this all in their heads? Is this some real bona fide crazy shit happening? And it does so better than most movies that try to do this. Every little sound effect, every shot, every scare, every piece of music, it serves one purpose: to put you on edge, and to grind you against that edge for about 2 hours. The film uses its runtime really well too. I think if it was shorter, it would make it easier to digest and it would have taken away some of its appeal. This is kind of like the movie equivalent of listening to Swans or Death Grips. You don't really listen to them because they sound good in the traditional sense. You do it because you want to be challenged and you want to see how far their unique and abrasive style can take you, because normal music just can't. Hereditary is a movie that, in a vacuum, might not be as effective. I think it relies on you having seen other horror films in order to catch you off guard, because it contains just enough tropes to make it feel intentional, but ends up twisting all of them in some really interesting ways. This is called
postmodernism,
which is a really vague and kind of pretentious term to utilize, but with the resurgence of post-horror, it feels appropriate. Basically, it's a fancy way of saying that a given piece of work relies on the audience's perception of other similar works in order to play on its established tropes and elements. But it ends up yielding a different result, that result often being a critique of the aforementioned tropes, but not always. In Hereditary, it's used almost purely to make the film as effective as humanly possible, which I think is genius. There is no bullshit here. It just sort of gradually acclimates you so that once you get to the third act, it becomes a Lars von Trier meets Sam Raimi-esque nightmare pocket of hell, and in the end is the only logical way a movie like this could end. I don't mean to take away from it. On its own, I still think it's effective and relentless, but I think the genius of the design is that it smartly psychs you out because you don't know what you're getting. And you end up getting something entirely different from anything you even remotely expected. And that's kind of what I wanted? To be tricked or cheated without even realizing that I was playing this movie's game.
Part 3. Family, tragedy, and mental illness.
The final reason this all hits home is that subtext I was talking about earlier. Effective horror always has it. Even horror that wasn't intentionally designed with this subtext has it. I doubt that John Carpenter really made Halloween with a suburban nightmare thing in mind. It just sort of embodied that idea in the case of right place, right time. So some movies can do this on accident. However, this very much is not. Not in my opinion, anyway. It's what makes horror have lasting power. The Shining works well not because it has scary scenes and trippy imagery, but because those scenes and imagery are grounded inside of a story about a father losing his grip on reality to the point where he harms his own family. That is the real fear. For a more modern example, we have a movie like The Babadook, which, yes, is scary, and it's a scary monster with a scary face that's brought to life through great effects and great camera work, but also because it's an externalized representation of the horrors of grief and the responsibilities of parenthood.
So, what about Hereditary? Well, half of the answer is actually in the title.
One of the reasons this so thoroughly got to me was because it tackled some very personal subjects that I myself am intimate with. That being mental illness, fractured family dynamics, and tragedy. This is what makes everything hit a little bit harder. It's because this movie is how all of those things feel. This movie gets to me the same way movies like Eraserhead do, where it cements this atmosphere and feeling that just takes root in your mind and never goes away. Eraserhead is a movie that looks, feels, and sounds like suicidal depression, meaning for someone like me, it takes on a whole new level of horror that it may not have been intended to put out. This film does the exact same thing, putting you on edge, leaving you guessing, and even being distrustful of the narrative, and never giving you a solid ground to stand on. That's what does it. This is how it feels to have anxiety or depression or feel grief, or even to be second-guessing your loved ones. It captured this in its most violent way possible, to force you to experience these feelings, and just in concept alone, I applaud it for doing that. Actually accomplishing that earns my respect even further. It also doesn't fantasize or romanticize the struggles our characters go through. Unlike some things that do it without tact or any real sense of investment, it makes it feel as scary as it truly is to feel that way. There are some terrific acting moments, especially from Toni Collette, where these ideas are conveyed, and you really feel the grief aspect of the narrative coming into play, showing how it affects her. Not to mention, she's the character that drives the second act of the film, and we begin to trust her perception less and less, much like we would a real family member who may be struggling with mental health problems or grief. It's explicitly stated in the film that the issues this family suffers from are largely, in fact, hereditary, and it's no coincidence that I think Colette's character being the center point of those ideas. Most hereditary and mental health problems originate from the mother's side, and in this film, these problems are the real horror. These illnesses grab you and change you and even destroy you, so all that horror feels very real, very genuine. Peter having to handle both his own problems and his mother's is the burden a lot of kids have to bear who are in that unfortunate situation. And frankly, I know what that's like. Not only is it unfair to heap all of that on a child, but it requires them to grow up fast in order to deal with that, something that Peter really struggles with. For those of you who wonder what those problems are like and have no frame of reference, Hereditary. This film is just what all of that feels like. It may not hit the chord that it did with me for everybody, but I think a lot of people who identify with these struggles will find themselves more appreciative of what the film has to say and how exactly it says it. The real fear is having experienced what it's like to feel all of that, and Hereditary exists as a reminder. It has a lot in common with It Follows in that respect, a film about the horrors of abandoning one's childhood and about the freedom of adulthood being far scarier than any monster in your closet.
So, it sounds weird for me to say this, but I would recommend that you see this film. Just know that I recommend it with a very large asterisk, in the sense that the film actually may be too effective. Because, it's literally by design that it makes you feel like shit. I mean, hell, I'd call this my favorite film of the year thus far, but favorite? Assigning a word like favorite to it just feels inherently dishonest. It's just unfitting and strange, because of the content of the actual film. And in a way, that conflict of me recommending it haphazardly, that's kind of why I love it. That sort of uneasy dread that I get when I say, you should see this movie, probably. Yeah, sure, it sounds detached and kind of cold, and it's really not the way I like to engage with most films, but I don't know, something about this one in particular just kind of hit all of the right spots, so it doesn't end up being a movie like Martyrs or Eraserhead, where I just can't find it in myself to say that it's an all-time favorite because of the actual content of the film being so thoroughly unpleasant. It's just that good that it manages to supersede that sort of classification for me. In fact, it's sort of similar to Manchester by the Sea in a lot of ways, just without the horror. The family drama part specifically, it has similar really evocative and emotional moments that just rock you to your core and show you things that you'll just never really get over, dealing with grief and tragedy and loss, except those films just sort of display their tragedy in different ways. This is proof that even genres that, let's be honest here, largely contain mostly schlock, do have a small group of films that belong to that genre that elevate it, that are smart, that are insanely well crafted and constructed, and deeply thoughtful, introspective pieces that can really challenge not only its genre, but the very medium that it's delivered in. Hereditary, in my opinion, is going to go down as a classic. It is an essential addition to the more recent roundup of post-horror that we've been getting. And you know, I'm really enjoying this horror film renaissance that we're getting over the last few years, because, good God, we get a movie like this and we have Suspiria to look forward to later this year? Good God. So reluctantly, Hereditary? Yeah, 10.
So I gotta guess, then I gotta stay the best man. What else you expect from Mr. Westman?